welcome to the Earthkeepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that Earthcare should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earthkeepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast. Hey, Earthkeepers. As many of us know, an over-reliance on meat in the way many of us eat can be detrimental to health, not just the physical health of our bodies, but importantly, to the health of the planet. However, even those of us with the best of intentions, myself included, find it really hard to imagine shifting toward a more plant-based diet because it seems so, well, to put it bluntly, kind of bland and uninteresting. Well, in this episode, we'll be in conversation with Dr. Jessica Schroeder, a woman who has made it her mission to show people that, with a little imagination, plant-based foods can be delicious, affordable, and good for the planet. On her website called Eden and Me, and through her podcast called Eating for Eden, Jessica seeks to inspire us to eat like Earthkeepers, with tried and tested recipes and with eye-opening perspectives on the true environmental impact of meat consumption. Joining me today as co-host is my friend and former guest, Joe Swinney, co-author of the book A Place at the Table, Faith, Hope, and Hospitality, and communications director of the Creation Care organization, Russia International. Joe is also the co-host of a podcast called Field Notes. Well, I am excited today to be in conversation with two very wise women, Joe Swinney and Jessica Schroeder. Let me just start, though, by welcoming you, Joe, back to the podcast. Our listeners might remember my conversation with you in episode 79 a couple of years ago, in which we discussed your book, A Place at the Table, Faith, Hope, and Hospitality. I'm wondering if you could just maybe catch us up. What have been some of the major highlights of the last 2 years, either professionally or personally?
Thank you so much for having me back, Forrest. And I can't believe it's been 2 years. That makes me feel a little bit dizzy and a bit lost. But in terms of highlights, so as you know, I work for Russia, which is a Christian conservation organization. And highlights of my job are always when I get to go and visit what's actually happening on the ground, because my job is pretty disembodied in terms of my day-to-day. I'm usually just sitting alone by my laptop. So highlights would be a visit to Kenya. I've been to Singapore and Malaysia in the last 2 years, and just absolutely love seeing real hopeful action on the ground. People with hands in mud and in the water doing good things for God's world.
Well, you also have started a podcast, I believe, in those 2 years, in which you highlight stories of the people that hopefully you'll get to visit one day. But folks who are doing stuff out in the world for Russia, how's that been going?
Yeah, we just uploaded our 50th episode today. It's called Field Notes, and we get to speak to an enormously diverse crew of people from around the world. And I do find it very inspiring, though I say it myself. Just hearing how people remain hopeful in the conservation space.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jessica, welcome to you as well. I've really been looking forward to this conversation, and I have to say I've especially enjoyed listening to your podcast called Eating for Eden, in great part because your really unique and thought-provoking approach to talking about earthkeeping is really providing me some interesting challenges, really challenges in the way I live my life. Maybe you could orient our listeners, tell us a bit about your website, Eden and Me, and your podcast, Eating for Eden. How would you describe the ways that you hope your readers and listeners will be impacted by your work in general?
Yes. First, thank you, Forrest, for inviting me to join. It's a pleasure to be here. So yes, Eating for Eden is the podcast, and Eden and Me is the food blog predominantly. Food has been a passion of mine for years and years. I mean, ever since just baking cookies as a kid and learning how to cook in college, and just realizing it was not just a creative outlet, but a delight for me to enjoy food and to enjoy it with others. And I just hope that people who visit the website and who listen to the podcast are inspired to take a look at their daily food habits and food choices and see how they're connected to caring for God's creation. That creation care isn't just conservation. It's not just taking action with regard to climate change, for instance, by thinking about energy and emissions in terms of, I don't know, the things that we typically hear about. So coal and gasoline and whatnot. It's impacted by everyday things like our food choices. And so I want to bring that message to people and make plant-based eating delightful and delicious through creating beautiful recipes and inspiring people to think more carefully about that.
Just generally speaking, how do you make the connection between a plant-based diet and Earthcare?
Yes. So when we consider what Earthcare entails, one of the big issues that facing us in this time is what we would call the climate crisis, global warming, climate change. So food is very closely tied to this. I think it doesn't get the press it deserves. I think in some circles it does, depending on who you're listening to and where you're getting your information. But I think it tends to be ignored a lot. Food production and food waste are both big parts of it. So there are a lot of different solutions that could come into play. Some of it's going to be based on societal and industrial things that just individuals like us who are not necessarily part of those bigger structures are not necessarily going to be able to have a choice in. But when we see something like the movement of bringing different plant-based milks into coffee shops, for example, I don't think I could have gotten an oat milk latte 10 years ago. Or if I could have, I don't know where I would have gotten it. And now it's so ubiquitous that chain restaurants, chain coffee shops are no longer charging extra for plant-based alternatives. And so you see that change does occur based on consumer choice and what our voices are. So to give just a short little expression of some of the facts, in general, most plant foods emit 10 to 50 times less than most animal foods. And that's just one picture. Now, that's emissions. There's also land use, there's water, eutrophication. There's a lot of different things we could talk about in terms of food's impact on the environment. But when you look at a chart such as those produced by Our World in Data, it's really undeniable what the most planet Earth keeping responsible choice is as far as where the bulk of our food comes from. Again, it doesn't mean that you need to completely shift your diet 180 degrees overnight, but the idea of asking where the bulk of our food coming from and what choices are we making to take care of the environment. Because when you look at the facts of how certain resources are used or emitted based on producing certain foods, it's very clear that plants have the least harsh effect.
Could I follow up that particular example that you brought up about plant-based milks versus dairy? Like, what's the problem with dairy? Like, why would it make a difference for us to, say, use oat milk in our coffee?
Yes, I don't have all the exact numbers right on the top of my mind or my tongue, but I actually do have a recent podcast episode about this in terms of like what's the best plant-based milk. And spoiler alert, the best is really just any plant-based milk is better than dairy. I compare greenhouse gas emissions, land use, freshwater use, and eutrophication, and cow's milk is the worst on all of those. There are two plant-based milks that come out a little bit better. Soy milk and oat milk are a bit better than rice and almond. Those are the four that are compared to cow's milk in the Our World in Data that I get that from. But yeah, just simply looking at comparisons like that, it just stacks up that those choices are so much better. And just to add real quickly too, something like a soy milk is a great option nutritionally to replace cow's milk because it's very similar in its protein content and because companies are thoughtful about fortification. And by the way, I think cow's milk is often fortified as well with something like vitamin D. You can get a good amount of calcium from a lot of soy milks. Just check the label for that.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and I will say that one of the strengths of your approach, especially in the podcast, is that you do provide data. You're not just making contentions out of the blue, that you're always backing it up with research or with statistics or with studies. And I think that, again, helps people to think differently. It teaches them how to think more critically and carefully about their food. So I appreciate that.
So you are inviting people to a more mindful, considered way of eating. And ultimately, that's a change and a challenge, because a lot of us, I'd put myself in there, we're considering factors like convenience and taste. We have an enormous amount of choice in certain parts of the world in terms of accessing almost anything you could think of wanting to eat. You can go and get it. And when it comes to adding into that decision matrix the impact on the planet, people can sometimes feel guilt or overwhelm. I'm wondering, as you start these conversations, you do have this beautiful, gentle, non-judgmental tone, but I'm wondering if the subject matter itself, talking about plant-based eating, puts people's defenses up straight away, or if you found it to be an easy conversation to start.
That's a great point. I find it depends on the person I'm talking to, which obviously makes sense. For the people that are kind of at the far end of the spectrum that are just very set in their ways and don't really want to hear anything, and even just the mention of plant-based eating or the environment kind of puts up red flags, and I kind of can tell when that's not going to be a fruitful conversation. But I find for the bulk of the people that I chat with, they get curious, because if I'm able to bring that up in a way that, like you said, is gentle and thought-provoking rather than judgmental or throwing out these shoulds or drowning them in data, I'm happy to provide information where people want to understand. So tell me how this hamburger is affecting the environment versus eating something made with chickpeas or lentils or mushrooms instead. I'm always happy to talk to people about those details, but I usually like to start with my own journey. What has changed my mind, what has been compelling to me, and also just, lead with the idea of taste and what's delicious. And Joe, you bring up such a great point about this, how many choices there are out there. And I think it's important to make sure that people don't think that I'm telling them, tomorrow you need to start eating exactly like I do. It's all about this idea of sustainable change. It's getting people thinking so that we start to live lives that are in alignment with our values. And sometimes we can go for years without recognizing that there's some area of our life that we're neglecting, but often because we just don't know. And so I think that's part of the grace that comes along with that conversation, is recognizing others haven't necessarily come to that crossroads that I've already been to. And so what does it look like for me to invite them along the journey, to be gracious, to start a conversation and not feel like I need to get them to a certain point during that first chat, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what Joe said about resistance. And I thought there's also someone on the other end of the spectrum who may really care about the planet, really want to be doing something to make a difference. And it's sometimes hard to know what to do. But in many ways, what you're talking about in terms of changing our eating practices, you're giving people something very tangible, very doable, and as you point out, very incremental, right? We can make small changes just one at a time. And so I find that that's actually one of the real appeals of your work, is that you're welcoming people to do something, do what they can do, but also to do it in a way that, as Joe put it, is quite gracious and invitational rather than guilt-inducing. So, intriguingly, on the website, you describe yourself as a one-time climate change denialist. So this, of course, brings up your transformational journey, which I really want to hear about, because I think probably there are listeners today who can definitely connect to that process, or maybe are in the transformation process right now. For you, what triggered or inspired this pretty massive shift in worldview and then practices for you?
Yes. I wouldn't say I can point to any particular, light switch moment or 180-degree flip. It's definitely something that was more of a dimmer switch, something that happened over time. In part, I would certainly attribute it to having gone through college or university, then getting a master's degree, and I actually have a PhD in theology as well. So having years and years of formal education where I'm surrounded by really great minds that are challenging me to learn how to think well and think better. I spent years wrestling with ideas and chatting with others about things that maybe we didn't see eye to eye on, and hearing different arguments for and against things, and recognizing that I think the environment in which I grew up, as far as taking on that kind of default of a climate change denialism. It was really just kind of fed to me from the news that I heard parroted around me. I wasn't really looking into it myself. I didn't care enough at that point when I was younger. But when I came to realize how important of an issue it is, if this thing really is happening, this global warming thing, then I should care about it as a Christian. And I think that came in dovetailing with a richer understanding of stewardship. So as I studied theology and biblical studies and getting deeper into some of the other implications of Genesis 1 and 2, not just origins questions, but what does it mean that God has placed humanity to be his vice regents, to be stewards, that we are to take care of and guard and keep and cultivate creation and not exploit it just for our own ends. Yes, we are the crown of creation, but we're to be here in God's stead, being the kind and gracious and loving ruler, so to speak, vice ruler, just as he is. And so having a richer understanding of that idea of stewardship, then it made putting together that with just the good thinking of, I need to learn more about this for myself. I just continued to hear facts that just seemed undeniable. You look at the breadth of the data and you say, how could someone actually deny this if they really, really look at it? And so it was one of those things I could no longer ignore. And once you see that, it just has to change the way that you live, unless you're going to hold a lot of cognitive dissonance and be okay with that.
Did you find it was a bit of an emotional journey to let go of the stance of denialism? Because I imagine there's something quite comforting about living in denial of a changing climate. And it also seems quite embedded in certain identities. And I'm wondering if you had grown up in a situation where there was just sort of an acceptance that you weren't going to engage in that kind of scientific data, and if that was it difficult changing positions?
Yes, in its own way. I think because when I'm convinced of something, I feel compelled. I must live in alignment with it. So in that sense, it's like, well, I have to do this. I cannot not do it. But then on the side of those are the waters in which I was raised, having a lot of loved ones that still kind of would find themselves in that position, it does make certain conversations difficult and strained. And sometimes I feel like I need to have all the answers ready in case I'm asked a certain question or someone throws something out about a particular public figure that said this or that. And it can be difficult at times to feel like, oh no, I need to try to convince someone with all the right facts. So definitely has been a challenge. But I think the part that's made it easier has been finding like-minded people and finding community with those that do see eye to eye and understand it. And especially those that are also of a Christian faith, to be able to have it more deeply rooted than simply this humanistic desire to care for the earth so that we can survive, but a recognition that it really stems from the idea of stewardship.
Yeah. So as you can probably hear from my accent, I come from a different part of the planet to you, but I am married to an American, so I have some understanding of how these issues play out in our different contexts, me in the UK, and am I right, you're in the States, aren't you? Yeah. So it's my perception is that it's quite sometimes climate and the environment, more broadly speaking, environmental matters are quite politicized and a bit contentious in certain parts of the United States. But I wonder if food is a really good place to engage on these topics, because regardless of your political persuasion, you will eat, and therefore you've been put in relationship with creation. And so you've probably got quite a winning route for peaceful conversation around this. Has that been your experience? Are people who aren't willing to have a kind of head-to-head debate over the reality of global warming or something, are they willing to talk to you about lentils v chicken production?
I think, at least to some extent, I mean, you raise a great point that it's something that we all do, eating. We all eat multiple times a day. Most of us actually enjoy the act of cooking and eating. And so it's a great just initial way to start a conversation. It often just comes up naturally too. So if you're at some kind of a potluck or a lunch event and there's a buffet and someone notices oh, you skipped the meat, or you ordered a vegetarian or a vegan option or something, and they ask why, then you have an opportunity to start a conversation, as I said earlier. And then also the idea of when I host people for dinner, I love to cook a variety of fun things that might introduce people to how plant-based eating can be really delicious and exciting, and that meat doesn't need to be the center or even at the table at all necessarily. So yes, it can be a great way to start conversations. I think where it can get a little tricky is when people maybe have a particular view of something that they've gotten somewhere on the internet, say like a YouTube or an Instagram or TikTok, where you have influencers that take a particular view on something, say like regenerative beef, I think would be a good example. While regenerative agriculture as a large term can mean a lot of different things, I think we need to be nuanced and careful in how we are using that term. But particularly when people point to something like regenerative beef is going to help us save the environment, I think we start to butt heads when people have a very clear commitment to something that seems really at odds with a plant-based way of eating, unless someone is willing to engage the nuance, such as, okay, maybe cows have a place, but at the scale at which people are demanding meat today, we don't have enough land to do regenerative beef for all of our beef consumption. And if you're not into conventional beef, then we all need to reduce, even those that are still going to eat. So just the math and doing the numbers, some people just are not necessarily up for a more nuanced conversation, and that can be challenging.
Yeah, my experience in listening to your podcast has been that maybe you realize that it's not just maybe the skeptics that you're trying to convince or challenge to think differently. It's even people who are in your camp. They're in the camp of earth keeping. And for example, I've made a commitment for various reasons to buy local as much as possible. And in one of your podcasts, you were talking about what's the real value of, say, buying local grass-fed beef. Seems like that's a blessed option, right? We can't go wrong. But you were very careful and kind in your explanation in this particular episode I listened to explain that it's not as simple as a label that says local. There are many factors that go into it. And really what I loved about your approach is that you encourage people to think differently, not telling them this is actually wrong, this is right, do right, but rather here are some questions to consider about the way you eat, about the way you live, and almost teaching people to think critically even about their environmentally responsible choices. Yeah, that's, I think, one of the things I love most about the podcast so far. So I appreciate that.
Thanks. I'm encouraged to hear that.
Yeah. Well, in my experience, people who are committed to anything Earthcare, as you are, tend to be motivated for a real love for nature. And I'm wondering first if that's the case for you, and then how, if so, you would describe your relationship to creation.
Yes, I like that you bring this up. It's a little bit ironic because growing up in the Midwest where it's humid and the summers are very hot and sticky and there are a lot of bugs, I spent a lot of time avoiding the outdoors. I love sledding in the winter. I loved the fall, being outside in the cool air, but I think spring and summer kind of forced me indoors, especially growing up not liking to do yard work and things like that. I didn't camp growing up. However, I did have certain pockets of nature that simply delighted me. So my family and I would go to Michigan every summer and spend time at Lake Michigan and just having something that's basically the ocean, but no sharks, no salt water, no fear. It was just a wonderful delight, and seeing the sun set over Lake Michigan, things like that. Skiing, my parents would take us out to California and Utah and Wyoming to ski, and just I can remember going through the sun-warmed ponderosas and the snow just glittering in the sun, and it just feeling like that was worship, to be in the midst of that and find myself just worship songs coming out of me by just being in that beautiful environment. So I think, yes, we all do and find ourselves connected to certain aspects of nature. And I think too, for myself, not just nature and as we think of it as like the outdoors, but the created world in and of itself, of which we are a part. Material things have always been precious to me. So I've been always interested in creative endeavors. So art, music, food as kind of an artistic outlet as well. So just the goodness of the material world and the fact that we can't have any of that without nature, without creation. That's all part of creation and just what we make of it, right? So bread, oil, wine that the Psalms talk about, we make those from the grapes, the wheat, the olives that God allows the ground to produce. And so I think that's kind of how I've come to a deeper understanding of that initial love for the spark of beauty and wonder that nature provides.
This morning, I was harvesting mushrooms. I've been growing mushrooms this year indoors, and it's been really kind of interesting. I was speaking to a friend who has tried the same thing, and we both agreed that our relationship to mushrooms as food is different because we grow them, right? And it made me wonder about you, someone who's so invested in food. Are you also a gardener, or have you thought about that if you're not? Just wondering, because it has so much to do with how we understand food. Is like getting your hands in the dirt and actually helping to nurture it does make a difference.
Yes, unfortunately, I live in a condo, and so I can only do like herbs in little pots on the patio, but I have had the experience of being a part of one summer's worth of gardening with my in-laws when my husband and I lived in their basement for a few months. And there is something incredibly satisfying for saying, I planted those seeds and it was the first time I ever gardened, and look at what happened. And just having talked to Ben Lowe, just on a recent podcast episode from Eating for Eden, just about that same kind of a thing. It's like, yes, we are part of it, but just seeing the way that God has created nature to be fruitful, to be a small part of that, to get it started and to tend it and then just allow it to produce is such a marvelous thing. And I think there's something really precious about being a part of that process that helps us appreciate it more deeply. We're far less likely to waste it. We're far more likely to savor it and to find more special ways to enjoy it, even if it's simple. The idea of just taking something like, let's say I have herbs on my patio and I have parsley or I have basil, just to do a really simple hand-crushed pesto or something in a mortar and pestle with just some fresh lemon juice, 1 clove of garlic and some olive oil, and just put that on a really simple pasta. Like, you don't really need a lot, right? You really enjoy the simplicity of what that thing is in and of itself and not needing to hide it or not needing to, overproduce it, so to speak. So someday I'd hope to have land for gardening.
Yeah, well, don't discount your herb garden. That's something.
So say you were going to have Forrest and I over for dinner and you wanted to super wow us with your plant-based approach to food. Could you talk us through your trip to the store or where you'd source the food and what you'd make for us?
Sure. One of my go-to things to make when I have people over, particularly for the first time, especially if I don't really know how they eat and I want to have something that's fun and delicious. And there's not meat and dairy on the table, but it's less obvious in the sense that I'm not just saying, here's a lasagna that I made without meat and without cheese. I love to make pupusas. So for those that are not familiar, a pupusa is a Salvadoran food and it's like an arepa. It's made with masa, so corn flour. And you basically make like a little dough ball and you fill it with things and then you fry it on 2 sides in a cast iron pan. So it's kind of like a little stuffed corn flour pancake kind of thing. So I like to fill mine with refried beans and onion or acorn squash and onion. And so it's very common in terms of like Latin and even Native American cooking those ingredients as staples. And then we'll top that with sliced avocado, cilantro, lime juice, hot sauce, even this kind of a slaw that I make called curtido. That's also a Salvadoran kind of side dish that goes with it. It gives that crunchy, kind of briny, salty kick on the side. So this very unique kind of cultural experience. And those are, as far as the shopping to table kind of process and experience, now I keep masa flour stocked in my pantry because I know when I have people over, I want to do my go-to pupusas. I keep canned refried beans around just because it's easier just to grab that right off the shelf as far as convenience is concerned. And then just grabbing onions and squash at the store. I might roast the squash in advance just so it's easy to throw it all together the evening of. I'll make the dough. I usually have music going on the background, by the way, because it's just fun. So I make the dough balls and I form each pupusa and I fry them in the pan. And as those are cooking, I'm preparing all the little toppings. So putting cilantro in a bowl and slicing up limes and whatnot, getting those things ready to go. And then it's just set up on the table and people, you kind of build your own adventure, so to speak, top it as you wish, hot sauce or no hot sauce, additional curtido, lime juice. And I find people just really enjoy that. And for those that are okay with consuming alcohol, a little vino verde is a lovely pairing with that. So I feel like it always goes over really well. And then it's an opportunity for people to be enjoying what they're eating while they're asking me about, why did you serve this to me?
What's for dessert?
It's for dessert. Often I'll ask my guests to bring a dessert if they offer something. But that's a good question. I'm trying to think of what my go-to desserts are. It kind of depends on the time of year, if I'm more in the mood for baking.
On your website, you've got this amazing looking raspberry and white bean concoction, which looks nicer than it sounds, I have to say. Like, I'm a little bit skeptical about putting beans in a dessert, but
so was I the first time I made something like that. But I'm a converted bean lover. Rancho Gordo out in California in Napa Valley. I am now a part of their bean club, which I have been on the wait list for over a year. So very, very exciting. But I'm a converted bean lover. I used to think, who in the world would put beans in chili? They don't belong. They're just mushy and flavorless. But I've come to adore beans. And
Jessica, what happens in a bean club?
every quarter you get a delightful box. You get a delightful box of 6 or 7 different pounds of different kinds of heirloom beans. So I have like a little cabinet right behind me. I could potentially grab them and show you, but there's like some of them look like little tiny cows. They're like white and black spotted. And then you've got like these massive big ones called Royal Corona beans that they're just luscious. You could make them part of like a salad with fresh tomatoes and basil and anything from something like a tiny little black bean to Christmas cranberry bean or Christmas lima bean. Anyway, there are just so many different varieties. I had no idea. And I finally found in a cookbook, like someone who was a part of this bean club and said, oh, Rancho Gordo, this is where you get, all these great heirloom beans. And I thought, finally, someone's told me where all these chefs get their special beans. So there's just so much nuance of flavor and richness. And back to the mushroom example for us, as you had mentioned, rather than just finding beans as something you kind of add to something as an afterthought, especially a canned variety that might be overly mushy from how long it's been cooked. Cooking beans fresh from scratch is just a whole different ballgame. It's like sourdough bread made at home versus store-bought sandwich bread. If people have never experienced that, I would highly recommend to try home-cooked beans. So back to the bean cake. Yes, it's surprising, but it's the kind of thing that it just works in. It almost has a cheesecake kind of feel or texture to it. I don't want to anticipate too much. It isn't cheesecake, but I think for someone who grew up loving cheesecake, it is reminiscent of that to me.
Well, I have to say that your website does a pretty good job of selling difficult things like beans in dessert. And part of that is your aesthetics. I mean, it's a beautiful website, and the photographs of the food are beautiful, and your explanations of the food are also really aesthetically sensible. And so there's something really intriguing that draws people in, I think. And yeah, I would love to try some of these recipes. That's my intention. Well, one of the reasons I really wanted Jo to be part of this conversation has to do more with the expansive view of food that I have learned from her, really, and from her family over the years, that food really has so much to do with community. And you've already given us a couple of examples, right, of how food factors into community events that you might be hosting. I wonder if you think about food in the same way, if you see food as essential to maybe creating a nurturing community. How would you describe some of the values that you hold about food in general and maybe the place of food in our lives?
Certainly. I love to hear that that's something that Jo and I share because, yes, I do see food as a very core part to rich community. I actually, in my master's work, I did a thesis basically studying theology of food and joy and linking those two together. And so as someone who loves to join at the table with food with others and enjoy good conversations over good food, I wanted to understand more about that connection. And so inherent in that as well is the suffering and the brokenness in our food system. And so I think that's why it's so important to have conversations like this, is to understand that, yes, while food does nourish us, and yes, while food is also very delightful and something to gather around, we don't want to live in denial of what might be a responsibility of ours to ask, what ought I to choose? If I have a variety of choices, then what is good, better, best? We never want to be in paralysis over, again, what is that ideal and trying to reach that. I remember going to the grocery store during my master's degree work while I was reading all these things about theology of food and whatnot. And I had the hardest time shopping because I had a very strict budget for groceries, and I was still eating meat at the time. And I thought, I can't just get this conventional, to my knowledge, cruelly raised beef or chicken or pork or whatever. And so I was like, how do I afford the best option? Yeah, it was really a difficult season for shopping. And then to get where I am today, it's an interesting challenge to gather with people. Let's say I'm at another person's house, and how do you say, if you don't have allergies, but you may have preferences, right? And again, it's a way to start a conversation. It's something that I never want it to get in the way of community. I think that's something important to keep in mind, is for those that are deciding to eat more plant-based because of their care for the environment, is how do we do this in love? Like, I think of people who, we're in the season of Lent as we're recording this right now, for people who are maybe fasting from a particular meal of the day, but maybe they're meeting up with friends or family during that meal time. What does it look like to break the bread of love, so to speak? So for instance, for myself, I still don't eat meat anymore, but I do on occasion eat fish. I'll on occasion eat egg in something, or dairy, especially if it's just a really good croissant and it's really worth it. I remind myself, it's not about perfection. It's about living in alignment. It's about reducing. It's playing my part, but also not being legalistic about it, and being able to receive other people's hospitable actions in love, as well as I would be hospitable to others in my home. So feel free if you have additional questions, if I didn't quite answer that as fully as you were hoping.
Joe, I'm actually hoping that you might comment on this as well, in your experience, just because you think a lot about this issue.
Yeah. I think food is one of God's very good gifts, and like with all of the best of what He has given us to enjoy and sustain us, it's got so many ways of going wrong. And to frame food around the intention, God's heart in giving us a way of sustaining ourselves that is not like little grey lumps. He could have made us such that we just hook into a port or something and it just fills up like a gas station. But instead we have this opportunity to do art and play and chemistry experiments and to connect with other people over that, and to have preferences and discover new combinations and new tastes. And so while it can go so very wrong, I try and remember the pleasure and the joy and God's gift of food. And there's so much love in when you prepare food for people as well. And in terms of how you've just talked about not confronting people too harshly with where you're at on your journey, I think that is so important, while not shying away from a really necessary challenge. And I think the more we know, the more responsible we are to make choices that don't fly in the face of that. When you know that a battery chicken is kept in abhorrent conditions, to choose to eat that or buy it or purchase it, you're then colluding in that. And so I think there's something about iron sharpening iron in us helping one another to make that kind of step change without making it a matter for not sleeping at night and that kind of thing. Because there's so much about our lives that are dictated by systemic stuff out of our control as well. But yeah, a little tiny change. I'm not all the way over into plant-based. My daughter is. And so we probably, as a family, we're eating no meat on 5 days a week now, which is a big change for us over the last few years. And when I do buy meat, it's the highest welfare, and I try and make it last several days of meals. And I really, really love butter and cheese and things. And I've recently tried to move towards grass-fed dairy where I can. At the same time, I do feel an enormous amount in the area of food. So I guess I'm grateful for forgiveness and mercy in that. Yeah.
Jessica, something is trying to come to the surface of my thoughts here. This Earth Keepers is a global podcast, and we really have listeners everywhere in the world. And I often think about how listeners who are variously located hear podcasts differently. So if you were to imagine someone, say, in Uganda, listening to our conversation, or perhaps in El Salvador, since we talked about pupusas, how might they be hearing this? And I guess my wondering here is, clearly when we talk about food availability, choice, affordability, it has so much to do with justice issues as well, both social and environmental justice. I'm wondering how that factors into your thinking and your practices.
That's a terrific question. I'm glad that you raised it, because I think it's short-sighted of us to not ask that question. A couple of things come to mind in response to your question. I tried to keep it in mind in general, like as I'm having conversations with people. I haven't yet thought how best to apply it, say, to my food blog or to my podcast in a sense of on a regular basis. But what I would say more broadly is that if someone has access to this podcast and they're hearing it, but they're in a place where they don't have a lot of food choice, then I would say, I'm not really talking to you, in the sense that I'm calling people who have the most choice and the most opportunity to act on that choice in their day-to-day food choices and their day-to-day eating. I'm calling upon those people to take responsibility. Those who have the ability thus have the responsibility. It's been helpful. I'm a bit of a nutrition nerd on the side. Part of my podcast listening that I am eager for after Easter Sunday to get back to is nutrition podcasts. And one of the things I've been reminded of time and again is that for those, for instance, in parts of maybe Africa, Asia, South America, even the States potentially, but particularly where people are really subsisting on just a couple of crops, something like dairy or meat may be a really important source of nutrition for them. But in the States and elsewhere where we have options for which protein powder we decide to supplement with, right? We have the opportunity to say no to a lot of things because we have overnutrition is more of a problem than undernutrition. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. And then also, even in largely developed places, there may be food access issues. There might be food available, but the access to that food is limited, whether that's because of where someone lives and whether or not they have the transportation to get maybe fresher food. They might be relying on certain convenience items. They may not even have the ability to cook that certain fresh foods, whether that's because they don't have the skills or they don't even have stove or even a microwave in where they live or are staying. And so I recognize that I am speaking to a certain segment of the population and making my recipes for a certain segment of the population that have the ability to make use of them. But I think it's important for all of us to remember and bear in mind that not everybody has that same level of option available.
Speaking of nutrition, do you have to supplement your diet as someone who eats largely just plants? Are you able to have a rounded enough diet for your bone and muscle health and brain?
That's a terrific question. The main thing is anybody who is completely excluding animal products, so anybody eating plant exclusive will need to supplement B12. That's very important. And that's very affordable. which is great. I take something once a week. Some people can do a daily thing. It's one of those things you want to talk to your doctor about what's the best option. But I feel like the supplementation I do above and beyond B12 is more just from the desire to have optimal nutrition. And I think that comes down to anybody might want and need to do that, right? It's not that plant-exclusive diets or even plant-predominant diets are necessarily inherently lacking. Yes, they're lacking in B12. That's why anybody who's plant-exclusive needs B12. But I think if you looked at someone who ate a, quote, typical omnivorous diet, they might be lacking in tons of vitamins that I'm getting through most of my vegetables, fruits, legumes, etc., because I'm eating a lot of those things and whole grains. So great question. I think that people tend to use that as a common criticism of a plant-predominant or plant-exclusive diet. And I think that I would ask them to look at their own intake and say, true, I may have to be a little bit more intentional about where I'm getting my calcium, maybe some iron, etc. But what might you need to be intentional about if you are sticking to the kind of standard Western diet that is heavy in meat and dairy?
I have taught community development for a lot of years, and one of my students who herself was a nutritionist but wanted to expand into community development work, she did her research in Uganda, and what she wanted to do was research traditional common diets, especially among rural folks. And what she found was that Ugandans, especially because of globalization and global communication, and even policies of some development organizations, were feeling some pressure to change their diet. A more quote-unquote civilized diet, a more prosperous diet was something that would include more processed food, that would include more meat, that would kind of eschew things like pumpkins. Pumpkins had become, in Uganda, stigmatized as the food of the poor because it was so easy to grow. But when you think about the nutritionist value of pumpkin in the diet, it's just crazy off the charts. And so she was really spending time, first of all, looking at that unfortunate pressure to walk away from traditional diets, which were actually better than global diets, but also was looking for lessons that we could learn from people in those contexts who actually knew about nutritional value of the foods they were growing and how to grow them and even how to prepare them. So to kind of bring nutrition back around to this culture and justice question, I think when I hear you talking about what you would fix us for dinner, pupusas, well, I visited El Salvador at one time, and for the meal that our hosts prepared for us or took us to, pupusas were the center of it. And it was the center of community. It was something that made them feel proud. I mean, this is our food, right? And so they wanted the Americans on the team to experience this. So I guess it just intrigues me that I wonder if there isn't already a place in your work for that highlighting of the wisdom that can come to us from maybe non-Western or even developing world contexts, more traditional or even indigenous contexts. You've cited indigenous traditions in terms of some of the food you've described. So it makes me think you're already doing some of that. You're sort of celebrating the wisdom. You're celebrating the things that we can learn from those contexts that we may be too proud or culturally biased against hearing.
I love hearing you say that, Forrest, because I think it's something I hadn't quite recognized, at least to the extent that you just made it explicit. I definitely know that I love looking around the world for inspiration because it's traditional cultures that have found delicious ways to prepare very humble ingredients, like you noted, and they're typically very nutritious as well. Beans being one of the key staples is, I feel like every area has a particular legume and a particular whole grain, and then whatever vegetables grow well in their area and fruits, and then throw in some nuts and seeds as well. And you get a whole range of different nutrients, different tastes and textures and flavors, and then opportunities to create. And like you said, Joe, play. It's an art form. And so it is such a joy to look around the world and see, yes, what are traditional staple ingredients or ways of preparing these things that we can learn from. And if people have enjoyed them for so many years, they must be worth trying, right? And I think when I consider what's, quote, normal food in somewhere like the United States or the UK and beyond, it really often is a meat-centered something with a side, especially if you think about like the southern United States, it's meat, potatoes, two sides, whatever. And I think helping people to reimagine what mealtime can look like, we have a great wealth of resources in other ethnic, indigenous, traditional cultures of the world. And I love that you bring that back up, and something that I think I'd like to intentionally delve into even more, not just, oh, what's a tasty Indian dish because I like Indian food, but what can I learn that maybe I haven't even yet discovered yet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess maybe I just want to affirm that I see that in your work already. So yeah, it's beautiful and would love to see more of that. So yeah, I'm glad there's some resonance there. Yeah.
I'm also glad to know that you had pupusas served to you while you were in El Salvador. That makes me even more excited to continue to share them.
And you've introduced me to them. I've never heard that word said aloud or seen it written anywhere. And I've nothing I'd like to eat more right now. Oh, is there anything that you really particularly hope someone listening to this conversation will remember from it or do differently because of it?
That's a wonderful question. I would hope that listeners would be curious to learn more, to recognize that no matter what you have choice for in other areas of your life, for myself, like I said, I live in a condo. We probably couldn't get an electric vehicle right now. I recognize a lot of us are in that boat, that you think about climate change. What can I do? What can I do? Well, you probably have some amount of choice that you can make about the food that you're eating. And please hear me say that this is not you must go change everything overnight. As we've been talking about, the idea of grace for the journey, of sustainable changes over time. It's about starting slow. It's about making one choice. It's something like you said, Joe, over several years, you've gotten down to 5 days a week without meat. And that's a terrific success to celebrate. Some people might start with a meatless Monday, or maybe no meat or dairy before dinner time or something like that. Or it may even just be when I'm out at a coffee shop, I'm going to order a latte with oat milk instead, or just go for an Americano or a drip coffee. So there are lots of ways to start. I think just picking somewhere, start where you are, do what you can, build from there. And that is what I would suggest for people.
Joe Swinney and I have been in conversation with Jessica Schroeder, writer and plant-based entrepreneur and founder of the Eden and Me Collective. For more information about her work and the resources that she offers, go to the Eden and Me website or to this podcast episode's show notes. Earthkeepers Podcast is a production of Circlewood, an organization that encourages people to pursue a more ecologically conscious faith. Our executive producer is James Amadon, and our sound engineer is Dave Olfers. Lana Rasmussen is our podcast editor, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media coordinator. Forrest Reed is the composer of our original music, and I'm Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. Thank you, friends, for listening, and I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of the Earthkeepers Podcast.